Welcome to the CHCH Newsmakers podcast. I'm your host, Rick Zamperin. If it's making news in Hamilton, Halton, and Niagara, across the country or around the world, we're going to tackle it right here on Newsmakers. It is called the oldest profession on the planet, sex work. Yet here in Canada, there's an ongoing battle to decriminalize it. What does that mean, and what are the odds of that actually happening? Joining us today is Jelena Vermilion, a Canadian sex work advocate and executive director of SWAP, the Sex Worker Action Program here in Hamilton. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
I love origin stories. Anyone who knows me, I love learning about how people got into things.
Sure.
How did you get into sex work? Tell us about that.
I was homeless in 2014, and I needed income, and I needed a way to stabilize my life. And I was living in the Kitchener, Cambridge, the Tri-Cities as they call it, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, where I grew up. And I needed to stabilize my life. And so I entered sex work because I had always seen sex work as a viable form of income and form of employment. Never judged people that were in the profession, and I thought it was a way that I would be able to make a survival, a living, and maybe get out of the hole I was in effectively, with being homeless. I was homeless for about 3 or 4 months, and I was able to get an apartment as the result of doing sex work.
Wow, look at you now. It's not like you can go to a job board and say, okay, I want to do that.
No.
How does this happen?
Well, I think in my case, I met someone at the shelter who was already doing sex work.
Okay.
She, was using a hotel. And it was through learning how she did her trade that I learned how to do mine and how I wanted to do mine. So it was, I wouldn't say that I was, procured into it. I would say that I was curious. I wanted to learn, and I made a decision to continue to do it. And then as my, financial situation improved, I was able to maybe change the way I worked, putting up a legitimate advertisement, putting up, or changing the way I marketed my services, if you will.
Right.
And I mean, at the end of the day, we're just talking about sex. It's not that controversial, although unfortunately it still is in society. And it's never going to lose popularity, I don't think. So it was a viable way for me to use the market as a transgender woman to, find stability financially in my life.
Without getting into great detail, was it scary at first?
Yeah. Meeting people and having intimate moments with strangers, absolutely. It's difficult to manage those moments because people don't really consider the skills that sex workers have when they're operating a business effectively. Maybe you have a website that you're a webmaster of. Right. Maybe you have copy on your advertisement that you've written yourself. And then also the interpersonal skills that come with sex work, that actually managing the emotions of a client. And when we're talking about transgender women selling sexual services, there's that added element of that client maybe has some internalized homophobia, transphobia. What am I gay for seeing this woman? Am I, because you're facilitating space for a person to explore their sexuality, and I consider that to be a sacred thing. And there are moments where, if that person has like some sort of guilt that breaks through or, shame, it could be potentially turn into violence. And thankfully I've been very, those moments really haven't happened a lot in my work over the decade that I've done sex work. But it can be scary because you're dealing with men. You're dealing with men who may do you harm. Right. And that's true whether we're talking about sex for, an exchange of something explicit or in any relationship where sex might happen, between a husband and a wife. There's power differentials in all junctures in life, and that's what makes it scary. Not, the fact that I'm selling sexual services, but rather that we live in a criminalized atmosphere. And if it was to go awry, the idea that if I called the police, maybe the police wouldn't take me seriously. They wouldn't consider me a credible victim, or they wouldn't consider the violence that I experienced if I experienced it. Maybe they might consider it to be an occupational hazard, an acceptable form of violence. And that's what we in society unfortunately do too much of, accept the violence that is subjected against sex workers.
I know you always have to be vigilant. Yeah. This is not an easy line of work. But when did you become comfortable with what you were doing? And did that take a while?
I think that there is a certain amount of, how do I say?
The intent is always up.
Yeah,
right?
It's, I'm always looking to provide like a good experience. It's not just about the physicality. It's it's about the connection, the meeting of the minds. It's about someone feeling like they've been heard, listened to, witnessed. Some people love their wives and their families, and yet they still see sex workers as the result of seeking intimacy, seeking connection. And that's true in any relationship, whether those relationships are sexual, romantic, or just platonic or familial. People are seeking connection at all moments in their life, and sometimes sex is a way to get that goal.
This might be simplifying it, but do you play psychiatrist at times as well? Maybe psychologist?
I do think that sex workers play the role of a therapist, even if they don't have, a psychological degree or, they don't practice psychiatry in a regulated sense. I do think that we are often in roles of a therapeutic role, a therapist role. We're doing emotional labor. We're taking care of a person in a one form or another. It's similar, I'd say, also to nursing in the sense that, not to be too graphic, you're dealing with bodily fluids, you're dealing with people's state of being, their wellness, and you're also assessing them. You're assessing for safety, you're assessing for their state of mind, what to do next, how to respond to the kind of behavior that you're seeing from a client. It's not always something lurid. It could just be simply this person needs to be touched at this moment, and this person needs to be, looked into at the there need to be, eye contact while they're speaking, or maybe, I need to offer up a piece of vulnerable information about myself to bridge that connection, because he's offered so much so far in this conversation. What am I doing to make him feel like this is an equitable exchange?
When you got into it, did you expect it to be that?
I don't know what my expectations were. I think, we all have been influenced by the media in the sense of different depictions of sex work, and is that piece of media produced by someone who's done it? We don't know necessarily. But the kinds of media that I was exposed to, which does inform my archival work with Swap Hamilton and the library, are pieces of media that I would consider to be more affirming. So I'm thinking of Billie Piper's The Secret Diary of a Call Girl, Harlots even, the more recent show based in the 1800s in the UK. They showed real nuanced depictions of sex workers that left me with the impression that they were working women. They were leading and operating a business in a difficult political and societal moment. And I think that the same thing can be said for most sex workers in 2025.
So you've been in the industry for over 10 years.
Yes.
How has it changed or evolved, or has it?
I will say as of now, as of living in City Housing Hamilton, I've stopped because if I was to do it in public housing, that would be an illegal act, unfortunately. And I'm already a controversial public figure, shall we say. So I don't, unfortunately, I've had to retire as a result of living in City Housing. But what that gives me the opportunity to do is continue the work with Swap Hamilton with more focus. And your question about, could you repeat the question?
How has it evolved?
Yes. So I would say I started at a time when Backpage was still operating. This is essentially a Craigslist-style classifieds website that was very popular for sex workers. It was seized in 2018 by the United States government, Department of Justice and Homeland Security, for prostitution being erroneously criminalized in the United States. That platform was used by many Canadians, many people from around the world to advertise and sell their sexual services. It even received an award from the FBI for participating and cooperating with them for human trafficking investigations by Carl Farrer. I believe it was the third, or Robert Mueller. You can Google it. The certificate's on there. And so what's changed is our ability to advertise and our ability to vet clients. It's become more difficult to ascertain safety with clients ahead of meeting them in person. So when I mention Backpage, I'm mentioning it because it was a very useful tool for sex workers and resource for sex workers to have communication with their clients ahead of being in person, so that they could avoid any potential violence. They could ascertain what services were going to be agreed to at what cost. And so you can imagine if you were to negotiate those things in person, that could potentially cause a conflict. It could cause an argument, and therefore maybe could lead to violence when we're talking about a criminalized industry. So advertising has changed. Our ability to vet has changed. When Backpage left, what filled the market was a website called Legalist here in Canada. It's basically the website that people now use instead of Backpage. effectively, sex workers are having to advertise across multiple platforms to get the same or even a portion of the amount of clientels inquiring for services as we did before. For myself, I noticed a huge drop in clientele inquiries after Backpage was cut off.
Right.
And, if you think about it, like, not every sex worker is seeing 100% of the clientele that are asking for service. So to have even less people asking gives the sex worker less option to vet and less option to choose which client she wishes to provide service to, or they wish to provide service to. So it's economically disenfranchising as well when we don't make it safe for people to seize clients in a safe way. That means that people are more impoverished and likely making more risky decisions, or more willing to make decisions that they wouldn't be willing to make if they were more economically secure.
That brings us to Swap Hamilton and its creation several years ago. Why was it needed, and what is it for those that don't know? Yeah,
so Swap Hamilton was originally started, we met originally late December 8, 2018, and we started doing work in, I think, January the next year. It was a group that was associated with the Gibson and Lansdale Neighborhood Association originally. There was a handful of members, some of whom who had lived experience and some of whom who had more management experience. So there was a former manager of a Toronto escort agency. And long story short, the people who had lived experience had conflict with people who didn't have lived experience, and we had a different idea of what we wanted SWAP to look like and what we wanted our work to center around. If I can be polite, I would say that the people who didn't have lived experience had a view to getting street-based sex workers off the street to eliminate the eyesore, as they put it, and we had the view to protecting their safety and rights and making sure that, conversations like this were happening such that we could, fully interrogate and interview our feelings about sex work and the Barton Street stigma, as I would refer to it, as its own phenomena. We want to encourage dignity, encourage conversation, encourage compassion, ultimately. And so through direct action, we just kicked those people out and decided, no, we are going to lead as sex workers because people have spent enough time speaking for us and doing things on our behalf that actually have been harmful and tokenizing. And so we decided to take the reins when we learned, the kind of future that SWAP may face. And we now focus on education, advocacy, and outreach as our three main areas of purview.
You mentioned the stigma of Barton Street.
Yes.
What is it? Is it still there? Has it gotten better or worse?
Well, I can tell you when I moved to Hamilton, I think one of the first comments that was said to me was, go to Barton Street and you'll get a hooker.
Right.
Or you can find hookers, and...
and you still hear that today.
Absolutely, 100%. And you know what? It's not inaccurate. There are sex workers that work their stroll on Barton Street between Emerald and Lottridge, I'd say. There are also other places through my research that I've learned are, either historical or, intermittent stroll areas. The stroll being a place where sex workers, advertise their services.
Right. Yeah.
Street-based sex workers is indicative of sex work being a class issue. People who sell sex on the street are often doing it for economically disadvantaged reasons. They may not be able to advertise online through an advertisement which costs money. Maybe they don't have access to a credit card to put up an advertisement. They also maybe, if they have a credit card or if they have some money, maybe they don't have the funds to maintain a cell phone or two cell phones if you want to have two separate numbers for safety. There are real considerations as to why people do sex work, and the main consideration for anybody doing sex work is that it provides a higher income than minimum wage and a flexible working hours. And street-based sex work is indicative of sex workers who are under, constraints in their work. They have to make money, and they know that selling sex is going to provide them a better income than flipping burgers, and maybe they can't even get a job that's minimum wage because of how difficult it is right now. We hear about students talking about how difficult it is to get a job, and Doug Ford yelling, oh, just try harder. But the reality is, even for those that are trying monumentally hard, it is very difficult to get a job in 2025. And even the most I wouldn't argue that they are easy jobs, but I would argue that they're entry-level jobs.
Sure.
As far as the wage is concerned, not the skill needed to do those jobs. That it's difficult for people to get any job. It's difficult for people to get a call back. The soft skills that are required that many of us lost during the pandemic, during lockdown, we're at a hard time right now. And so those who do sex work, especially on the street, are also having a hard time. And we need to understand that it's a class issue at the end of the day. And I think that in a world where sex workers could be offered indoor spaces to work, which all the data shows is much safer and actually in many cases eliminates the threat of violence in their work, I think this stigma of the Barton Street phenomena would be dispelled and disillusioned, because as the saying goes, you destroy your enemy when you make them your friend. If people could understand what sex workers experience and the kind of discrimination and the dehumanization that they're faced with, not just in Hamilton, but all over the world, from the beginning of our story as a human race, people might treat them better, and they might be less quick to be so venomous with their tongue.
Is part of the stigma that all sex workers are on something? They're on some kind of substance, and this is why they kind of tumble into this?
I think that there is, there definitely is stigma against people who use drugs, people who do sex work, and people who are homeless. And I think when you see a street-based sex worker, you assume all three. They're homeless, they're poor, they're using drugs. But we also need to investigate why people use drugs. Why people on the street are using drugs. People who are unhoused are using drugs. People use stimulants on the street because it keeps them alive, because it reduces their appetite, and especially in a colder climate, it keeps their body heat closer. It's called centralysis, where the blood remains in the torso, and it reduces to the limbs and the tips of the fingers, so that your brain and your heart and your organs are getting the most amount of blood. It is not ideal. It's dubious. We know this. We know what someone suffering on the street from some drug-induced state looks like. And I'm sure that person wishes they weren't in that state also.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the compassion that I encourage people to take and embody, what Swap Hamilton intends to do in society, in Hamilton and in the greater world, is ask why, and think about what it would be like if you were in that situation. Because even if people are using drugs in their sex work, maybe there's a reason for that. And we shouldn't be so quick to judge or condemn people just because they're engaging in behaviors that we couldn't see ourselves engaging in. Maybe we couldn't see ourselves engaging in those behaviors because we have enough money that we never would have to engage in those behaviors. And that's a class issue, right? It's a justice issue. It's a women's rights issue. It's a disability rights issue. And also it's a trans issue. Trans women are often relegated into sex work because they face discrimination in secular, meaning non-sex work forms of employment. If we don't look cisgender, if we don't get surgeries and take hormones to look like we pass as quote unquote regular cisgender. Regular isn't the correct term, but I've already said it.
I know what you mean.
What we think of as women in society, cisgender women, then maybe they wouldn't be in sex work if we could get regular non-sex work jobs. And maybe if we could get jobs that pay a livable wage, or God forbid, a wage that allows us to thrive. Maybe we wouldn't be doing sex work. So stigma ultimately comes from not just misunderstanding, but also like this scapegoating of bodies. I could never be in that position because I'm morally correct and better. So it creates this juxtaposition. And so does the criminalization when we say they're criminal for doing that act, for selling sex. Why is a sex worker on the street criminal, but a wife not criminal for, exchanging sex for a beautiful home to live in, for a husband that treats her well, maybe buys her jewelry sometimes, sends the kids off to camp with his salary, who, there are exchanges happening all the time. Some are criminalized and some are not. And some are institutions that are encouraged by the state. Some people get tax benefits from being married, right? I think that we need to really think about sex work as an economic activity and a labor activity that doesn't have the same protections as other labor. And in Hamilton, being such a labor-centric labor-centric city with our history of activism and labor activism, I really think we should be focusing on this as a labor activity.
Ballpark, how many sex workers are there in the city?
Hundreds.
Really?
Hundreds.
Wow.
When we did our...
I would have guessed dozens.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I mean, hundreds. We also have to consider the types of sex work there are. You know, it's not just prostitution,
right,
selling of full service sexual services. It also could be webcamming. It could be selling porn videos. It could be stripping. Remember, we used to have several adult entertainment businesses until they were eliminated, or grandfathered out of existence through zoning and bylaw, etc. There's, as I kind of alluded to, being a spouse can be a sex work. And I'm not just saying a woman in a heterosexual marriage. There's always exchanges happening in relationships that we agree to, and some are socially acceptable and some are not. You know, is a husband a criminal for taking his wife out to dinner and then making love to her? I argue no. And I argue that neither is a sex worker, right? For facilitating what ultimately is the same thing but in different formats. Yeah. I think I forgot your question.
No, it was how many sex workers there are in Hamilton.
Right.
So you nailed it.
When we did our YWCA community-based research, we had the privilege of speaking to 40 sex workers because that was how limited we were in our funding.
Okay.
Because we wanted to make sure that every sex worker was compensated in that research. That was 40 homeless street-based sex workers alone.
Wow.
So, you know, of my friends, of them that I know do sex work, you know, there's that milieu, and then there's the homeless sex workers, the sex workers that are more impoverished, if you will, and then there's the sex workers that maybe would never publicly identify themselves as having done it or doing it currently because they do it as, you know, under the table, not under the table meaning financially, but they don't tell their peers, they don't tell their friends, they don't tell their family that, yes, I sell sex on the side, I have an OnlyFans, I do this, I do that. But I mean, especially during the pandemic, we saw the proliferation of OnlyFans, you know, over 100,000 accounts in 2020 were opened. That's sex work, whether we'd like to admit it or not. You know, being a sugar baby even is like a phenomena, a type of sex work that it's people like to say that they're not engaging in prostitution, but effectively there is a sexual exchange, even if they wouldn't like to focus on that. There's many kinds of exchanges like this in society. And ultimately, if you're economically disenfranchised, you might consider doing sex work. And so that's why with a population of over 500,000 people in Hamilton, there's quite a lot.
What would SWAP Hamilton's biggest accomplishment be?
I think through our research, we have accomplished a changing in the zeitgeist. I think SWAP Hamilton, if you look at the historical articles about people who do sex work, and, you know, I've had the privilege and pleasure of speaking to Susan Claremont in my research and had a 45-minute, she was very generous with her time, interview with her, talking about her perspectives, because she obviously reported on a lot of these assaults and murders and violence against sex workers. And I will say that one thing I'm proud of and one of SWAP's largest accomplishments is changing people's hearts and minds. We want to, it's not just about making you agree with us, because ultimately we don't mind if you disagree with us. What we care about is that you are speaking in a way and promoting a society and a Hamilton that says it's not acceptable to allow violence against sex workers. The woman who was nearly killed, who was maimed, who lives in a long-term care facility on between Salamaria and the other business in that alleyway near Emerald. You know, when we had so many people show up, including, you know, Cameron Crouch and other amazing community leaders, to show solidarity for that woman, that's our accomplishment. The humanity, to instill humanity back into the conversation, and to say that we're talking about people. We're talking about people, human beings. Who cares if they sell sex? We're talking about sex. It's a pleasurable, normal human activity. Why should we be punished? Whether we're women or men doing sex work, whether we're, you know, we are people, we should not be promoting the denigration of another human being. And I believe, and SWAP believes, that stigma, when we stigmatize other people, that's truly the degradation of another person. That's what truly degrades another person, is to say, to society, to promote the idea in society that these people don't deserve dignity. They deserve to die because they sell sex. No, not at all. They deserve to, like any other person, make mistakes. And I'm not saying that doing sex work is a mistake. I'm saying that, you know, we talk about the correlation between drug use and sex work because of stigma.
Right.
Because of the, maybe some of us think of street-based sex workers strung out on the street as the immediate stereotype. And that's it, stereotype of what sex workers are or could be. And, you know, talking to anybody from a group that you don't have a full understanding about, misgivings about even, can open one's mind. And I think that we've been, as SWAP, been given a platform in order to speak as sex workers, to speak from our experiences. And, you know, like, I know what it's like to feel worthless. I know what it's like to feel downtrodden. And I try to embody an ethic, an ethos that models behavior that is benevolent. Maybe not benevolent, that's saying, maybe that's a little too patting myself on the back. But what I mean to say is that it's compassionate. It promotes compassion because it's beyond empathy. It's, I want to end your suffering. And part of how we end suffering is by changing the way we speak about people, because we hold the power to publish or to eliminate stigma, and we choose to combat stigma.
Thanks for opening up, by the way. I mean, it's not an easy topic talking about, you know, the harms that are being done to people who don't deserve those kind of, you know, injustices. And,
you know, a lot of the times in, you know, the media or social media, you see the hateful voices drown out the good people, the people who care, the people who still have a head on their shoulders. And, you know, it does get me emotional because this is my community. And, you know, I belong to many communities. I'm also a trans woman, you know, talking about what's happening right now in the political sphere. You know, we are being used as fodder, and it's not okay. There's a lot of propaganda, and there's propaganda about sex workers and sex work, and this false feminist idea that to do sex work is inherently violent. No, what is violent is you telling me what to do with my body or not to do with my body, right? We want to, when we think about the obfuscation of the conversation, when we talk about human trafficking, the conversations of human trafficking, which, yes, trafficking happens, and we want to eliminate anybody being forced into any kind of labor, whether sex work or agricultural work, you know, migrant workers working on farms. We want to make sure that people are protected at work and that they're not being exploited, regardless of what they're selling or doing.
Absolutely. SWAP's work with the Office of Community Engagement at McMaster University. This is near and dear to your heart. So tell us about this.
So we're really lucky. SWAP Hamilton is actually a community partner with the Office of Community Engagement. We started with, how did we actually connect? We started connecting. We've done so much, it's kind of all blurred together.
Right, yeah.
We connected, I believe, originally through my work with Dr. Andrew Zafiro, Communications Associate Professor with McMaster, also an outstanding scholar named this year. We started doing a research project using zines as a methodological form of data collection and dissemination. We met with, after our outreach research, we did a call out for another research project where we had sex workers come participate in the YWCA. It was in a training room in the YWCA. And we created art together, and there were prompts for each of those. And it was about digital securities and cybersecurity. So the idea that the internet, as we see it and use it today, was developed largely using technologies that sex workers used originally to market their services to their clientele. So I'm thinking payment processors, JPEGs, even early ASCII graphics were used to look like sexual figures and to promote services of sex workers. But then they were deplatformed. So you know, PayPal doesn't allow sexual services. You know, you can't purchase things using PayPal like that unless they're through a proper payment processor. We've been eked out of our own communities, even though we built them. And another different example is the West. When we built the cities and we had the miners, well, sex workers tempered their labor through providing sexual services. We built many cities, and often we can't really participate civically in them. So it's this juxtaposition of, what can sex workers do on the internet now versus what did they create? And so these participants were able to give their perspectives specifically as people who are accessing the WISE services. So people who have experiences of being homeless, people who are doing street-based sex work, etc. And we ultimately published 4 zines called Trespassing, volumes 1 to 4. And it was excellent. It was a really great exploration of what digital security meant to people, what technology means to people who are disenfranchised from society. Pardon me, my nose is itchy.
That's okay. You're nominated for, and congrats on this, by the way, an honorary Doctor of Laws degree at McMaster 2026. How did this happen?
Kind of unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, I guess people believed in me. So my work kind of extends across multiple sectors. We work at the library. We've been working on our archive for over 5 years now. We've had a memorandum of understanding since 2021 with the HPL, Local History and Archives. This is like the production of a huge swath. To give an idea, it's about 28 bankers' boxes large right now.
Wow.
It's almost as large as the Hamilton Council of Women Fawns collection, and larger, I believe, or approaching as large as the Matthew Johnstone Fawns.
Wow. And this is all research in this
So
collection?
what this is a collection of media. So it's books, some of which are, autobiographical, some are memoirs, some are more policy-based, educational-based. There's like Palgrave Macmillan Springer books, for example.
Okay.
And effectively in the pandemic, in the lockdown, I started being exposed to different books that I hadn't ever seen before. And I was like, wow, these are amazing. I want to learn more about them. And like, why haven't they ever been digitized? Why haven't people seen them before? And then effectively I started scanning books, creating an archive of books that had never been digitized before, rare print, out of print, stuff like that. And then also curating and consolidating books, more newer books that maybe there was already a PDF out there of, right? And this is a collection of material that is meant to be for researchers. It's meant to influence social policy, public policy, and the history, effectively, so that people can understand what sex workers have been saying over decades of advocacy, and hopefully that any research that's done in the future is being done in a culturally competent way. So this collection is housed at the archive. This the archive itself and it's being built was part of what brought on the nomination, because it's, if you read the letter that Anna Patterson from the HPL wrote, it was very flattering and also underscored the importance of how these materials are going to allow researchers, the way she put it was, researchers will be ecstatic for decades to come to access the materials. Nice. And I did that myself. And it's about, the funds that go into those books, but also the fact that it's a curated resource from someone who has been in the industry, who understands, what kind of information is important to glean and what information is not. So there's the archive. There's also the fact that we've participated in the city, different committees, delegating to different committees, the Police Services Committee, Emergency and Community Services, Governance Sub-Review Committee, General Issues Committee, etc. The LGBTQ Advisory Committee back when it was, running. We are actively involved in our civic discourse in order to improve the lives of not just sex workers, but also for transgender, non-binary, intersex, and two-spirit people who are gender non-conforming or gender diverse. We want a life that is safe for all of us, and that begins with not just representation, but also people like me being respected and taken seriously. Right. So thank you for having me here today.
Good for you. No, thanks for being here. Let's talk about decriminalization, because there is some confusion around how it works. Yeah. Sex work is decriminalized in New Zealand, Belgium, and parts of Australia. Yes. So what does that mean, and what is legal and what is not?
Sure. So decriminalization is the removal of all mentions of sex work in the criminal code. Okay. Effectively removes the state's ability to have an influence over your sex life. So bringing up the quote from Pierre Elliott Trudeau about not having the government in our bedroom, we can't say that. So I'm thinking about, for a second, buggery, formerly anal sex in the criminal code. It was effectively a way that homosexuality was criminalized in Canada. Right. When we decriminalized that, we didn't go back and recriminalize it, right? So keep that in mind. Okay. So for sex work, in the Bedford case, in 2013, it was 3 of the laws were found unconstitutional. The body house law, the communicating law, and living off the avails of prostitution, or material benefit as it's now called.
Right.
And so effectively it was decriminalized for a year, and then Parliament instituted what we now have, PCEPA, or Bill C-36, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. Of course, they frame us as exploited persons because they see sex work as inherently exploitative.
Right.
I'm sorry, repeat the question again. My ADHD.
Decriminalization.
Yes. And so in Canada, we had it for a small period of time. Decriminalization effectively removes the state's ability to control. In New Zealand, we have examples where sex workers can now use the decriminalized atmosphere as a way to protect their labor rights. So if a sex worker sees a client and that client doesn't pay, she can call the police. And there have been many examples of that since decriminalization in 2003. It's been decriminalized for 22 years by Georgina Bear, a Maori Indigenous trans woman who died recently of kidney failure, I believe in 2016 or within the last 5 years.
Okay.
That sex worker can make sure that the police get involved. The police no longer have a conflict with sex workers because sex workers aren't seen as doing anything unlawful. What they're doing now is seen as lawful. So the police have no reason to be in conflict with the sex worker. And when that sex worker calls for help, if she's been, extorted or not paid for services, the police officer will call back to the client and be like, you need to pay her. You need to pay the sex worker.
Like any normal business.
Like any other business. Right. Exactly. Because, it's this fact that it's revolving around sex that we have such a hang up in society. Yeah. And it's not just lack of education, it's also moralism, it's religious dogma. And Hamilton is a much more Catholic Toronto, as they used to say.
Right.
So, there's reasons for people's hang-ups around sex. Decriminalization effectively removes that control such that sex workers, their activities are lawful, so that if they are victims of violence, they can call the police, and it improves those relationships. Maybe they won't be perfect because of, history, but it will remove that conflict. We do not want legalization, talking about the juxtaposition of decriminalization here, because it would make the state the pimp.
Okay.
It would create a 2-tier system innately, because there would be people who do sex work who are willing to participate and cooperate with whatever regime is created under legalization. So let's say the legalization of cannabis. We don't want 37 brothels on the street like we have dispensaries, which, I think a lot of people think they're they're excessive. Even if they smoke cannabis themselves and they enjoy it, they think, wow, there's a lot of dispensaries, like that's a lot.
Right.
Well, there's a certain fear that brothels would proliferate. Well, we don't want that. We would want them to be private homes, pretty discreet. And so when you legalize, there's things that would be instituted, maybe licensing, maybe mandated health checks, STBBI checks.
Right.
We wouldn't want that. Why? Because unless everybody who's having sex is forced to have STBBI checks mandated under the law, then no one should. Like, sex workers shouldn't be targeted as a group of people, because your average Tinder date is taking less precautions than a sex worker.
Yeah.
Like, your sex worker, that's their business.
Yeah.
They, literally their business. So they are going to use condoms. They're going to use, things that make the exchange more protected as far as a vector of disease or potential transmission of something is concerned. Sex, it's not economically smart to not protect oneself sexually. So we need to respect that sex workers are sex professionals, and for those that can be licensed, that do want to follow those regimes, sure, that's fine and dandy. But for those that can't, we're talking about street-based sex workers, we're talking about poor sex workers, or even sex workers that just have conscious that don't want to be subjugated by the state regulation. They would not cooperate just by their personal ethics. And those groups of sex workers would then be illegal sex workers and would also be subject to the same criminalization as before legalization.
Right. Would decriminalization also come with some sort of health care or benefits, or how would that work?
So that is something yet to be seen. Decriminalization is a first step into sex workers being, treated as normal laborers. Of course, the Occupational Health and Safety legislation and Employment Standards Act would also apply to sex work as it would any other industry and any other labor. The issue is, and it's not that far of a cry. Actually, in my research, we learned about the Canadian Association of Burlesque Entertainers, which actually Hamilton instituted stripper licensing fees as a result of them. They were a local with the Canadian Labour Congress, Local 1689, CABE, and so sex workers have actually unionized in the past. They've been in Hamilton, they've been in Toronto, and they did many functions where they were talking about unsafe working conditions, like their stripping, their change rooms, the stages themselves, the material, whether it was safe to walk on and without slipping. Decriminalization would allow for these labor protections, and it would allow for conversations around what that actually means. Right. I think, each industry and each profession has their own college. So I don't know if that would if that's something that would happen if we'd have a college of sex workers. Right. But I do think we'd have a regulating body.
Yeah. We got about 10 or 15 minutes to go here. City of Vancouver did something unique, maybe not unique in Canada, obviously.
Yes.
In terms of an audit. Talk about this audit, what it was for, and why it's important.
Yes.
And why it should be brought here.
Yeah, so the City of Vancouver did a transgender safety audit effectively, focusing on transgender, gender diverse, and two-spirit peoples, and asking, how can we make the municipality more safe, more inclusive for people who are transgender, transsexual, intersex, non-binary, two-spirit, etc. And they did this by doing surveys. They did this by consulting with trans people and actually hiring trans people to do these interviews and these consultations for the city. So not just paying bureaucrats and paying nonprofits and funneling money through nonprofits to do report work effectively, but also giving money to the communities, nothing about us without us, that are impacted by these consultations and the following policy that would be implemented. Certain examples they did this, looking at washroom signage. So instead of saying male or female, saying like this washroom has urinals and this washroom doesn't have urinals. The function of the washroom and not necessarily like the social role for the person entering the washroom. Excuse me. There's also inclusive training for human resources. So, employees of the city would be mandated to getting these cultural competency and basically sensitivity trainings to understand what lived experiences of trans people are like. Excuse me. I should drink some water.
That's okay. While you get to that, I'm just going to remind our audience, too, that we're also going to talk about the digital billboard ads in Hamilton that popped up last month. But just quickly back to the audit and why it's important to, do something very similar here in Hamilton.
I think it's really important because Hamilton has been referred to as the hate capital of Canada. I think that 2019 wasn't that long ago. The Pride, the whole debacle, and then there was the investigation showing that the police had an inadequate response. It's no secret that the police have a controversial and very strained relationship with different communities, racialized communities, the queer community, sex working communities, and more. And that's because of history. That's because of historical trauma. It's also because of power imbalances. And when we talk about the safety audit through that the City of Vancouver has done and is doing, and again, it happened in 2016 and again this year. So it's been a long-standing consultation and consideration of that priority population. Right. In Hamilton, the culture is often unsafe for people who are queer. And I'm not just saying trans people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, all of us. We have faced, I think, historically, a lot of discrimination. We have one gay bar in town, and historically, a lot of our cultural spaces haven't lasted long, or they've been eliminated or targeted through political means or otherwise.
Right.
We don't often have a space where we can be safe, and especially, let's use my example. John Paul Danko was found to have violated the code of conduct when he was on the council because he spoke to me disrespectfully after winning the YWCA award, right? It's embedded in our culture. if someone like me, a leader, is able to be insulted publicly, and then they twist it as if I was just using the media to, for PR, as if politicians don't do that all the time. I guess they were just mad I did what they do every day, being a prostitute, to the public. Yeah. And it's actually ironic. I want to mention in one of the legal in a jurisprudence case, the Deborah Hutt case, 1978, the legal test that they used for a sex worker being pressing and persistent, that was the only way a sex worker could be arrested at that time in 1978, was if she kept harassing you for service, to ask if you wanted to purchase services. Right. They compared a sex worker on the street to a politician. So if you were willing to vie for votes, like a prostitute vies for services, then you could be considered. So I, if we're looking at the culture of Hamilton, basically, council and the media has often maligned people from certain demographic groups, and we need to have some sort of institution of training and a culture shift in Hamilton where those conversations are more centered around humanity, around people, that aren't infantilizing or tokenizing people, and that aren't dehumanizing people, and ultimately encouraging trans people being in roles of power, and centering their voices around their own experiences.
There were some digital billboard ads last month in Hamilton. We had the news story here on CH calling for an end to gender-affirming care for trans youth. And this is, I think, a small part of the reason why you're running for mayor as well in 2026.
Yeah, well, part of the reason I'm running for mayor is because we can not get our current mayor to meet with us in person to discuss various things. But the billboards, yes, are a great example of that as well, because, we in the past we had the Christian Heritage Party who put up the bus ads, which were eliminated as per the litigation. Yep. Now we have ARPA doing these billboards that are discouraging healthcare for youth who happen to be queer. Let's be clear. I'm going to give my own personal example just because that's all I can speak about with authority. I started hormones at 17, and when we ask children to go through their puberty in a body that is excreting hormones that maybe don't match with what they want, you're asking that child to suffer. You're asking that child to wait until they're 18 to grow a mustache and a beard when maybe they don't want to, and maybe when the conversion of the follicles from sweat glands to hair follicles through testosterone. I'm talking about trans women specifically. Is a traumatic experience. If you're asking a kid to wait till they're 18 in order for them to, take a medication that you wouldn't personally take and don't agree with, I think that's unethical, because would you tell that same kid to not take Tylenol when they have a broken bone? Would you tell that child to not take charcoal if they overdosed on medication? No, you would encourage that healthcare. And unless you yourself are a healthcare provider and an expert or a trans person, you have no business speaking about these things. And I think it kind of tells on itself that people in positions of power, people associated with religious bodies, are spending enormous amounts of money in order to effectively have an opportunity to litigate. That's the only reason these people do this, is they want to change the discourse, and they want to change the zeitgeist. They want to discourage solidarity for trans people. They want to discourage compassion for trans people like me. Well, I'll tell you, in the last year, I was assaulted with a weapon. They were charged. I've had threats uttered at me. They were charged. I've had my personal property, including an e-Gale garden sign that said support trans youth, because I was a youth at one time. I was one of the first participants of the OK to Me program at K2B Counseling. Saved my life. I've had my personal property related to my identity vandalized, mischief and vandalism. The courts, the e-Gale data shows that hate crimes against queer people have increased 388% over the last, I think since 2019, over the last 6 years. We're in a dire time. And so when we see people basically playing with our lives as fodder, it's really important to institute a safety audit that's trans-specific, because this is a life or death thing. People are using our lives as a means to promote or to further their own agenda. And their agenda is a religious, dogmatic one, says that I don't matter, that I'm not a real woman. And frankly, we don't need you to placate us. Right. We don't need you to be like, oh, you're a woman, you're the gender you say. We just don't want to be harmed. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be disrespected. It's not difficult to refer to a trans person using their pronouns or the name that they've identified, just like it's no more difficult to refer to a famous person who uses a nickname, because we respect that. Okay. Or an animal. I often see people, lovely dog, how old is she? Oh, it's a he. Oh, I'm sorry. Like, they have this big reaction for an animal or a celebrity when they make a mistake, but they have no consideration towards the humanity of a trans person when that same mistake is made, or when they've identified their name or gender. Mm-hmm. Trans people deserve to live. We deserve to grow old in safety. We deserve to, be respected and considered. And ultimately, we want a city that promotes those values. They talk about children growing old. Well, I was a child once, and some children are gay, and some children are trans, and we need to have a world where they can figure that out for themselves. Yeah. And discouraging healthcare is not going to help that.
We got a couple of minutes left. I want to talk to you about your archival research project. Sure. On the adult entertainment business in this, or history in this community.
Yes.
In a nutshell, what are you hoping to achieve?
So it was granted a grant through the W.A. Percy Foundation for Historical and Social Studies. We have, for the last year, been looking at newspaper records, Archives of Ontario records, Library Archives Canada, different fonts collections, the library. We're looking at police reports, etc. We're looking at the history of policing in Hamilton, how the HPS sort of proliferated, when they professionalized in the 60s and onwards. We've also looked at stuff as early as the 1800s. We're basically looking at what adult entertainment businesses existed, why they are no longer existing in Hamilton. Mm-hmm. We also are looking at the history of different bylaws and zoning, how those changed over time, and how discourse in city council and through different municipal minutes, how these licenses were effectively stigmatized out of existence. I remember there's one quote where they basically admit that 90% of the backlash is moral, but yet they allowed that to go through, right? And so, our research is going to show the history of policing in Hamilton, the history of adult entertainment businesses, but also the history of sex workers. I've been able to have a lot of primary sources through my work, my research, and I've learned about different sides of stories. You'll read a newspaper article, and then I've had the privilege of being able to speak to some of the people that those articles are about and hearing their sides and hearing, well, actually, it was like this. So we're hearing a lot of oppression of sex workers. We're hearing a lot of suppression of our voices. For example, in 1986, legalized prostitution was sprayed in red on the City Hall building. Reg McGuire was, I believe, the one who took the photo or reported on it at the time. Lots of interesting history, lots of pushback from sex workers, protest, and a lot of unfortunate religious dogma that has suppressed our businesses. Right.
When do you hope to release your findings?
So the actual grant period starts next year.
Okay.
I've been working on it for the last 8 to 10 months or so. And so now that we have funding, I'll be able to use that funding towards reproduction fees, getting certain documents, travel, etc. And then the idea, we're trying to publish an article in the Canadian Labour History Journal about CABE, Canadian Association of Burlesque Entertainers. And then we are also looking to publish either a book or some sort of publication where people can scrutinize the data. We'll be having a data management plan through the McMaster University's Research Data Management Group. And we will be allowing people to go back into the data and scrutinize it after we publish what we publish.
I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Me too.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
And for having this raw conversation.
Thank you very much, Rick.
That is it for the Newsmakers podcast. And a big thank you to the all-star cast behind the scenes as well. If you liked today's episode, click the thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment as well. Catch the Newsmakers podcast on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.